Good afternoon, or morning or evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation on how to prepare for the HPCSA's board exam for psychologists and psychometrists, and counselors for that matter. My name is Professor Llewellyn van Zyl, and I'm from the Northwest University, the Department of Industrial and Organizational Psychology. I'm also the current president of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. The whole purpose of this recording is to provide you with an orientation on how to prepare effectively for the HPCSA's board exam. We'll be touching on some of the aspects relating to the content of the study material, give you a little bit of an indication between the difference between ethical dilemmas and ethical problems, and also to provide you with some other technique that you can utilize to be able to manage ethical problems within industry. So, what are the four main outcomes of this presentation? First one is to explain the most prominent ethical issues and principles relating to the practice of psychology within South Africa. Secondly, to discuss the functions of the ethical codes, the legislation and their application within the South African context. We want to start to differentiate between what's the difference between an ethical problem and an ethical dilemma. And finally, we want to describe some issues involved in practicing psychology ethically. Alright, so before we start with the actual content of the HPCSA's exam and so on and so forth, we first need to really understand what is ethics and what is an ethical framework. Sometimes you really start to think that ethics are just there like a stick approach, where it's you either do X, otherwise you're going to get Y, or you're going to get into trouble or lose your license. That's not the reason for ethics and for ethical processes. I really believe ethical processes is a way for our past generations to impart their knowledge and the experience on our current generations. The reason why we have ethical codes is quite simple. The fact is, people have done certain things in the past which either worked or didn't work, and it provides us with an opportunity to be able to learn from those experiences. So what are the main principles of ethical practices? The first thing is what we call beneficence. Beneficence means nothing more than doing good, doing what's right, and helping others. In contrast, non-maleficence, which basically means avoiding harm, doing no harm. So do you see the difference between the two? On the one hand, we have doing what is good and right and virtuous for society, and the other one, it is about avoiding harm. Alright? And it's important to understand that it's also avoiding harm from not just your clients, but also towards yourself and the larger proportion of society. And we'll give you some examples later on what I exactly mean by that. The third component is the whole thing about autonomy. Here it's very important to understand that the client is an individual, and we need to respect the way in which he functions, which he thinks, and not superimpose our value systems onto him. In one of the cases I've managed currently, it became apparent that a clinical psychologist tried to force her religion onto a client, and therefore doing harm by superimposing her value system onto him. So we're trying to avoid things like that. The fourth component then relates to integrity, which means you need to consistently practice what you preach. You need to constantly deliver on what you've promised, and being sure that you always keep the highest level of personal and professional integrity. Finally, there's the whole concept of justice, which means what's the balance between the welfare of the client versus the welfare of others. For example, if you know that a person is HIV positive and he is sleeping around with a whole bunch of individuals, but he's your client, what is your responsibility in relation to the other people that are not your clients? So, do you have a duty to inform them? Do you have a duty to protect your client? And that is what makes this whole ethical thing so interesting. It's about the balance between what's right for the client, what's right for society, what's right for you, and everybody else involved. Okay, now that we know what ethical frameworks on what ethics is, we need to start thinking about what is ethical decision making. And this is the basis for the HPCSA's board exam. It's about arguing and justifying the decisions that you've made, because in most cases ethics are not black and white, it's usually in the grey. So if we look at the first point, ethics is not usually what's right or what's wrong, or what's ethical and what's unethical. It's about what is the most right decision that you can make in the given situation or scenario. Because the same choices or the same scenario can be played out in various different timestamps, but you might choose a different approach in each one of these, which doesn't mean that the one is more ethical than the other one. It's about what is more right or more wrong in a given scenario. It usually involves weighing up what is the best possible solution or outcome or situation for the current problem. Finally, we need to start to think about, when we make ethical decisions, about what are the likely positive and negative outcomes for the course that you have taken. For example, in the previous scenario where we discussed the HIV/AIDS patient, how would you know what is the positive and the negative aspects about disclosing or not disclosing that information? You have to kind of weigh up the pros and the cons of the scenario. But again, both aspects, whether or not I will disclose or not disclose, has pros or cons, and it's up to you to justify the reason why you have taken a certain or a given action. It doesn't mean that one approach is right or wrong. That is very important to understand. It's about what's right or wrong in the current situation. And that's what we want to try and do now, trying to provide you with some other basis or platform or skill set to be able to help you to make better ethical decisions. So when we apply now that we know what ethics are, what ethical decision-making processes are, we need to think about how is ethics applied within our realm as psychologists, psychological practitioners, psychometrists, and counselors. So it's important to ask the question, why are ethics important to us? First thing, a professional psychological relationship is always unbalanced. You as the counselor, as the psychometrist, as the psychologist, is always in an authoritative position. What does that mean? That means by the mere fact that this person has come to you, it places you in a higher position, which means the individual or your client or your patient is more susceptible to being influenced, being taken advantage of, and so on and so forth. And it's important for us to understand the nature of that relationship from a psychodynamic perspective, but also on how to manage it from an ethical perspective. Because of this power dynamics and this authoritative positions, the mere nature of psychological relationships are complicated. First thing is, the clients come and present with their own issues, their own problems. That by itself, the mere nature of that, is already complicated. In other words, if I come to you as a patient with depression, the fact that I'm depressed is already a very unique process, and everything related to that is very complex. Now, because of the fact of these power dynamics and so on that I spoke about previously, the nature of our relationship also becomes interesting, which could lead to very possible positive or negative outcomes depending on how it is managed. I will give a practical example in another slide on how such a relationship, this unbalanced relationship, can be capitalized or not capitalized, can be exploited to the therapist's or the psychologist's favor. It's very important to understand that you as a practitioner, you're human, and that humans are imperfect, which means we do make imperfect decisions. So it doesn't mean that the approach that you've taken now is necessarily wrong. When you've thought about it, when you've weighed up the pros and cons, when you've taken the best appropriate action in the given situation that you thought would be the best outcome. There are also then guidelines provided by the Department of Health, as well as the, ethical guidelines are provided by the Department of Health through the Health Professions Council to provide us with guidance on how to act in certain scenarios in certain ways, and also to ensure accountability for our actions. So, what are these ethical codes? These ethical codes are guidelines for practitioners on what they can and can't do, or how to act in a certain scenario versus another one. For example, one of the guidelines within the ethical forms of HPCSA indicates that you're not allowed to have multiple relationships with clients. That's an interesting one, because it means, like, if I am your friend, I'm seeing you as a client, and I am doing work for your father, that means the mere fact that I'm in these different roles will influence the effectiveness of the therapy, but also influence the nature or the dynamics of the scenario. Therefore, it's important not to engage in multiple relationships. Secondly, ethical codes are usually written very ambiguously, which means that it would say you're not allowed to engage in sexual relationships with a client. Okay, that one is kind of straightforward. Or you're not allowed to you're not allowed to work on a family member. However, in the medical profession, if you drive on your way to Karoo, you're a medical doctor, you drive in the Karoo, your brother's sitting next to you because it indicates that you're not allowed to work on family members. Your brother puts his arm out of a car, a truck drives off the arm of your brother. Are you, because the guidelines indicate that you're not allowed or not permitted to work on family members because of multiple relationships and so on, are you not going to try and contain the bleeding, work back the arm, or whatever the case might be? Of course you are, because you've got a certain skill set. And in that scenario, the best possible outcome and solution for that was to be able to help your sibling, because of the fact that there's possibly a hospital only 400 kilometers south, and you won't be able to get there in time, and etc. So these codes are usually written very ambiguously, so to provide us with some leeway room in terms of its interpretation. Alright, so ethics in psychology. Within the South African context, there are various parts of legislation, various types of policies and processes that governs ethical practices within South Africa. Within our context, if you go and look at it from the HPCSA, there's a list of the classification of tests, which gives you an indication of what tests are considered psychological in nature. That's Form 207. We have generical ethical guidelines and rules, Annexure 12. We've got policies on the classification of psychometrics, 208. We've got the revised policy on undesirable business practices. So those are the policies from the Health Professions Council. Then we've got the Mental Health Act, the Child Justice Act, the Basic Condition of Employment Act, the Labour Relations Act, the Children's Act, the Criminal Procedures Act, the Examination Policy, when you're going to write your exam, the Code of Good Practices for HIV, the National Health Act, and the various scope of professions and scope of practices. So these pieces of legislation and documents govern ethical practices within psychology, within the South African context. Okay, so why are there ethics, or why are there legislation that governs psychology? Because we engage in what we call a psychological act. And a psychological act is something that only a registered practitioner may engage in. So what is this psychological act? In terms of Section 31 of the Health Professions Act, a psychological act basically involves 6 things. First thing, it's the evaluation of human behavior through stuff like therapeutic interventions, psychometric assessments, projective techniques, and so on and so forth. So it's about measuring human behavior, which includes emotional states, psychopathology, competence, personality, emotional intelligence, those type of aspects. The second part of what's a psychological act refers to the actual techniques that we utilize to help people. So that's stuff like therapeutic interventions, or positive psychological interventions, or therapy, or coaching. The third part then is to develop and control psychometric instruments. That one is pretty straightforward. So only psychologists can develop a psychometric or psychological instrument, and they need to also be governed and managed appropriately. Hypnotherapy is another aspect. This is different to hypnosis. So hypnotherapy is utilized in a therapeutic context to help to assist an individual to manage traumatic experiences, or start to lose weight, or whatever the case might be. Hypnosis is something totally different. And that's why it's also governed by 2 different processes. Also, psychotherapeutic interventions to manage or change behavior, and then also preventative psychological interventions. These are aspects that we call psychological acts. So, who might engage in psychological acts? Any person registered under the Act in relation to the category of psychology. We'll get to that in a second, but it's important to understand that even though you're registered under the Act as a psychologist or psychometrist or counselor, you still need to do that within your personal or professional scope of practice. Okay, let's look at the different types of scopes of practice. So, we basically have a number of types of psychologists. We have clinical psychologists that works primarily with severe pathology. We've got counseling psychologists. We have educational psychologists, research psychologists, and industrial psychologists. Most recently, 2 new categories have been introduced. We have neuropsychologists and forensic psychologists, and we'll get to them in a second. Then we also have intern psychologists and student psychologists. So a student psychologist and an intern psychologist, you register that before you become a psychologist. We've got registered counselors and intern counselors. We've got psychometrists and intern psychometrists. And there are still some psychotechnicians left, although this category has fallen away a good number of years ago. There are still, I think, about 8 or 9 still registered in that category. So, let's look at the scope of practice between the different categories. So, a clinical psychologist basically assesses, diagnoses, and intervenes in severe psychological, in situations where there are severe psychological distress and psychopathology. So think of them basically as working in your neuro clinics and those type of aspects. Counseling psychologists, a bit different towards clinical, they basically work with people that are relatively normal, that are suffering with day-to-day normal life type of challenges, conflict management, unable to get out of a relationship, those type of aspects. So that's what they basically focus on. Educational psychologists basically work with children and adolescents with things relating to learning disabilities, psychological adjustment, school readiness, those type of aspects. So it's about helping a child to function better within an educational system. Industrial psychologists, like us, we apply the principles of psychological practices within organizational contexts. We help individuals to optimize individual and group performances through various types of interventions. So we work with people that are relatively normal within organizational context to be able to help them to perform effectively within their work environment. Research psychologists, on the other hand, they basically do psychological research on everything ranging from pathology to the development of psychoeducation. Let's look at the main study material for your test, for your examination. Now, there are basically 11 categories in Form 12 or Annexure 12 of the Health Professions Act that you need to study for your exam. The first stuff relates to professional competence. We talk about professional relationships, privacy, confidentiality, and record keeping, fees and financial arrangements, assessment activities, therapeutic activities, psycholegal work, advertising, teaching, training and supervision, research and publications, and how to resolve ethical problems. Now, given the nature of all of today on the following, the first 5 and the last one, the rest are pretty straightforward. Alright, so the first component then relates to professional competence, and there are certain things that we need to look at in terms of this section. The first thing is, you can only practice in relation to where your competence is limited. In other words, you can only utilize services that you've been professionally trained in and mentored in that process. Otherwise, you're not allowed to engage in those types of activities. For example, an individual that has never been trained in projective techniques can't utilize a projective technique as part of their practice. You can't utilize things like psychometric instruments that you haven't been trained in. The same thing with types of interventions. You can't utilize art therapy if you haven't been professionally trained and mentored in it. So you're only allowed to function within the boundaries of your competence. And remember, what do we mean by competence? From the Health Professions Act perspective, you are only competent if you've been formally academically trained. In other words, you've got a a certificate that is that has been registered with the Department of Higher Education alongside professional training in a specific area. It does not include things like continuous professional development sessions. So just because I attend a session on coaching, 1 or 2 CPD sessions, doesn't mean that I'm qualified to be able to do that. So that's very important to understand. The second part then is we must continuously try and maintain our current competence. And that's where the whole concept of CPD comes in. You're required to constantly update yourself in terms of your skill set to ensure that you are still able to practice or utilize that. For example, a surgeon or a medical doctor that was formerly trained in doing LASIK eye surgery, if he hasn't done that in 10 years and all of a sudden he needs to do it again, he's got the skill set, but because of the fact that he hasn't done it in 10 years, he probably forgot a whole bunch of those aspects. Therefore, it's important to ensure that you constantly maintain and upskill yourself in terms of your specific competence, in terms of the specific skill set, so that you can ensure that you can provide a quality service and product to your clients. The third one is we must always add new skill sets and new competence. Again, similar to the first point, we must be professionally trained in it and must be professionally mentored. The fourth part is the whole thing about extraordinary circumstances. Like the indication of a medical doctor that we spoke about earlier, and with various types of psychologists, you are in extraordinary circumstances. You are allowed to provide certain certain interventions that you might not have necessarily been trained in. For example, as an industrial psychologist, I am not allowed to engage in therapy. However, a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, industrial psychologist, very senior, that studied or completed his master's degree in the 70s, where they still had things like pathology and that on a master's level. It was about, I think, on the 24th of December, and a lady phones him up at like 9 o'clock in the morning saying that he needs to see his husband, he needs to see her husband because he's going to kill her. So my colleague says, well, okay, bring him over, let's talk. No other clinical psychologists, no psychiatrists available in Vanderbijl Park where we live or where we practice. So he sits down, and then the client says, I can see my wife having sex with the neighbor. However, the neighbor has never been in the house. This person suffered from a delusional disorder where he started to physically see and experience things that weren't there. So in that extraordinary environment or scenario, my colleague had to engage in therapeutic interventions to be able to assist this person just till a clinical psychologist could get back to Vanderbijl after the holidays. So in those type of scenarios, it's important to understand that you are allowed to engage in these activities in extraordinary circumstances to provide almost like psychological first aid, if I can say it like that. But you're not allowed to withhold techniques either, so that's important to remember. The next component is the whole thing about personal and professional impairment. What that basically means is if a practitioner is not able to function at a certain level, he's not allowed to practice. From our perspective, some of the most recent things are psychologists that suffer from psychological disorders, things like schizophrenia or delusional psychosis or those type of aspects. They are physically impaired to be able to practice professionally, and therefore they need to voluntarily remove themselves off the register. When it comes to personal impairment, it means that you're not able to function effectively as a practitioner because there are some other aspects, whether it's physical, whether it's psychological, whether it's emotional, that impacts on your ability to practice as a practitioner. Then, when we talk about delegation of work, usually this happens when practitioners delegate work to their secretaries or to intern psychologists, psychometrists. It's important to understand that you are always responsible for the outcome and for the work. Because my intern messed up doesn't mean that my intern, or that I'm going to get away scot-free from this because it was my intern. I am still the person that is responsible for that that intern's work, and as such I must always make sure that I sign off on their work, and not just physically signing off, going through it, making sure it's on standard, and making sure that no harm has been done. Finally, very important, especially in our South African context, the use of interpreters. This becomes even more increasingly important when it comes to psychometric assessments and when it comes to therapeutic interventions, because you need to ensure that the interpreter that you are utilizing is not only competent in the language, the two languages, but also that you will adhere to the process of confidentiality and so on and so forth. So it's important to ensure that you familiarize yourself with the reasons why we utilize interpreters, under which conditions we can utilize interpreters, and how to manage that process effectively. Okay, the next component that we're going to talk about is professional relationships, and primarily this refers to the respect for human rights. Sounds easy, right? Treat clients with human dignity, respect their values, and ensure that you respect their right to integrity. Sounds very easy in practice, or in theory, doesn't it? However, we tend to, like I mentioned earlier, one of the matters that I had to manage quite recently was a clinical psychologist that tried to superimpose her religion onto a client as a mechanism for him to be able to cope with his depression and anxiety. Basically what happened was that the individual came to the clinical psychologist saying that he was suffering from a breakup with his wife, a divorce, going through a divorce, and he was not able to cope with the scenario, and she tried to constantly say that, but he needs to start to believe in God, because God, whichever God, I'm not sure, will provide him with the strength and the abilities and etc. to be able to get through this, because he won't be able to get through this on his own. However, him as being agnostic or an atheist or whatever the case might be, did not believe in this, and because of this fact that she tried to superimpose his value system, it actually worsened the scenario. So it's important to understand that you should always treat your clients with human dignity. They are people. In that scenario, you should take yourself out of your own values and motives and processes and ensure that you help the client from his perspective. Respect his values, his customs, and always ensure that you respect their right to integrity. Continuing, if we speak about, let's go into a bit more detail. The next component in professional relationships is the whole concept of informed consent. Now, you're not allowed to engage in any activity that your client hasn't agreed to. You need to know exactly what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how it's going to cost, who you are, where you come from, what you're competent in, what you're not, what's the nature of confidentiality, what isn't, and etc. So you really must provide him with all the information so that he can make an informed decision as to the nature of the therapy or the nature of the intervention. So, what do the things related to informed consent consist of? Firstly, the financial costs of the counseling, the therapy, the coaching. You need to be upfront in relation to your payment structures. In other words, I charge 760 Rand or 1,000 Rand a session. I bill once a month, whatever the case might be. You need to be upfront with your payments. You need to discuss any types of special arrangements and agree upon how it will be managed. For example, if you need to go to a client's office once a month because of the fact that he can't get to you, you need to discuss exactly how it's going to work, for how long it's going to be, what the nature of the special arrangement is going to be, and what the outcomes thereof is going to be. You also need to be open and honest about your level of competence in relation to this. You can't say I'm an expert in family therapy, but you attended only a CPD course and now you're engaging in full-fledged family negotiations, mediations, therapy, and so on and so forth. You need to be efficient or explicit about the limitations also of your competence. You need to also be upfront related to the nature of the treatment. Is it a new technique? Is it experimental in design? All these aspects need to be discussed up front, and the process that you engage in and the paradigm from which you work needs to be presented clearly to your client so that he can understand. Finally, you need to always ensure that you discuss confidentiality and the limitations thereof, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. But it's important for him to know when you will disclose and when not to, for him to make an informed decision about. The next component we talk about unfair discrimination, and I've spoken about the whole concept of superimposing your values, but also we should try and stay away from stereotypes. So what is a stereotype? A stereotype is an assumption we make based on a person's race, gender, age, the way in which he dresses, how he thinks, how he feels, and etc. So we have to start to move away or not utilize or not engage in stereotypes. We should refrain from discrimination on demographics, as we've mentioned, and ensure that you apply interventions that are appropriate for that given client. Let me give you an example. If an African client sits in front of a white Afrikaans male therapist that has had no training, in cultural sensitivity, multicultural intervention, and so on, if this African individual indicates that my ancestors spoke to me last night and they indicated the following, from that perspective, from a total Western perspective, you say, okay, well, that sounds like schizophrenia, the guy's hearing voices, and so on and so forth. But from his cultural perspective, that's how they relate to others. So, by not understanding the context, you can do harm. So it's important to understand that. The next component that we talk about, sexual and other types of harassment, and this is something that is quite common in psychological practices. First thing, you need to ensure that you are not allowed to engage in sexual harassment, so that one we know. But you can only engage in a sexual relationship with a client after 24 months, upon ending therapy. Remember that when we spoke about earlier the power relationship and power dynamics? If a person has issues with their parents, like back in the day, that means that this person is, for example, more inclined or more susceptible to certain types of behaviors, and which makes them more vulnerable in that matter. So you're not allowed to engage in those type of activities. But other forms of harassment, for example, constantly texting your client or emailing or that type of matter, that can also be construed as harassment. Avoiding harm, always ensuring that you try and take the appropriate action that will limit the amount of harm that is imposed on your client. So you won't utilize a technique, for example, if a person is suffering from a social phobia or a phobia of snakes, you won't on the first day throw them into total immersion therapy and hoping that they will be overstimulated and get over it. So you must try and design your interventions alongside your client in order to ensure that there's no harm done. Finally, you must always declare your conflict of interest. So, and that also touches on some of the aspects related to multiple relationships. Because of the fact that I'm acting as an academic supervisor for a certain company, but the guy inside the company, that's the CEO, is also my best friend, and I was utilizing or doing him a favor for that matter, and now they're asking me to do some work for them, helping them to do some assessments. Now I am, because of the fact that I'm involved in the academic supervisor for the interns, it means that I won't be able to think logically and clearly when it comes to certain aspects, because my other relationships might be influenced because of it, because of that conflict of interest that I have in one of my roles. Multiple relationships, we spoke about earlier a little bit. That means that you're engaging in more than one role at the same time. So for example, one of the most recent cases that was presented was a clinical psychologist was acting as the therapist for one of her students, but she was also a lecturer for that student, and that student also stayed in her backyard, in her garden flat. So that means you're entering into multiple roles in this person's life, and the one role obviously influences the other one. For example, if I can't pay my rent, I can't be expected to act objectively in a therapeutic relationship with that client, even in relation to the lecturer as well. Similarly, if you've got a relationship with your client's friend, partner, spouse, parent, etc., that also indicates multiple relationships, because now you get access to other people's views and ideas and thoughts and facts and etc., which might influence the way in which you approach your client. Further, you must also always try and avoid to promise to enter into other types of relationships afterwards. For example, whether it's a love relationship, whether it's a business partnership, whether it is future consultation, or whatever the case might be, you are not allowed to enter or make promises to enter in other relationships afterwards. Then, exploiting relationships, for example, interns or students. You can't engage in relationships where you are exploiting a vulnerable adult. What I've noticed in practice sometimes is that the supervised psychologist would have the student go and stand in queues for them at the Department of Motor Vehicles, or Department of the Traffic Department, to go and renew their license. So because of the vulnerability of the student, because they need to be signed off, or the internship needs to be signed off, they're willing to do basically anything to be able to do that. So it's important to understand the nature of the dynamics of the relationship, but also to ensure that you avoid exploiting those relationships. Finally, there's also the you're not allowed to interrupt psychological services, and if you are, it needs to be negotiated beforehand. Let's get to the next component, which we talk about privacy and confidentiality and record keeping. Remember earlier I said that a person has a right to confidentiality? Yes, he does. However, there are certain exemptions to that person's confidentiality. That means confidentiality means that you're not allowed to disclose anything that happens within a given therapeutic relationship. You must always discuss the limitations I spoke about, and also the limitations to invasion of privacy. For example, you might have heard I've been utilizing some practical examples of past case studies and things that happened. I'm providing you with enough information to transfer the intent of the message, but not enough for you to identify the client. And this can also only be done in certain scenarios, which we'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so what are the exemptions to confidentiality? So when are you allowed to disclose? Firstly, you must always ensure that you've discussed this with them beforehand, with your clients, before you even do that. The second part is then to get written consent from your client, indicating that he is allowed, that you are allowed to disclose the information to whichever party. The third part then talks about if you're ordered by a court of law to disclose information, you have to do that. You can disclose to appropriate individuals, which is other professionals like other psychologists, medical doctors and so on, relating to the therapy. Or if you are struggling with a certain scenario, you can discuss the content or the nature of the problem that you're experiencing with the client with a more senior psychologist, but also ensuring that you do not give enough information away to so you can still protect the identity of the client. You can only disclose if the person's safety, if the client's safety is in jeopardy, or the safety of others. So if he indicates that he's going to kill himself and you really believe that he's going to, or he's going to go and shoot up a school and you believe that he's got the capacity and that to do that, that's when you can disclose. And then finally, when you have to claim from medical aids, because you have to provide an indication of the type of treatment that was applied. Okay, let's get to the more interesting one. Reporting abuse or vulnerable adults. It is your responsibility in all scenarios to report any type of emotional, psychological or physical abuse of any adult, any individual, any child. A vulnerable adult is someone that is defined by law, that does not have the capacity to be able to think and function effectively by themselves on their own. That's, for example, like children, people with mental disabilities, and so on and so forth. Okay? Finally, we talk about record keeping. You must always ensure that you take extremely good notes. Save your files, people. Save them. Make sure that you take explicit notes. My memory is very bad. So if I don't write things down, I will forget. And if I get to a court of law, or being challenged on a certain approach that I've taken, or so on and so forth, I need to be able to provide evidence of conversations, of etc. etc. So you must always ensure that you keep good and accurate records, even in relation to billing. Alright, hey, look at the next step, billing, fees and payments. Again, make sure on the first thing before you engage with a client, make sure that you arrange what your fees are, how you will go about collecting the fees, what's the most appropriate treatment and cost of treatment, and so on and so forth. Secondly, you must avoid overcharging. Now, overcharging is a very difficult one because there are no physical standards on what is acceptable for psychological services. The Board for Healthcare Funders provides a list or acceptable or what they will pay for as medical aids for certain types of services. However, it is very difficult to differentiate between the cost of certain services. But you can't charge, if it's standard, if you've charged a client, all your other clients, 700 Rand for a session, and now all of a sudden you get a rich client, you charge him 10,000 Rand a session, that's exploitative and that's overcharging. But it's difficult to manage this one appropriately. However, the next one, not so much. Accuracy in billing. As with any type of service, you want to know exactly what you are getting paid, what type of service you are getting, what are the fees associated with each. So you can't charge 60 or 100 Rand for drafting a report if you didn't draft a report. So you must always be accurate in terms of your billing, and also ensure that you utilize the right ICD-10 codes if you, for example, claim from a medical aid. Collection of outstanding fees, and this is kind of a sensitive one for us because we as psychologists are not very good at this process, and this influences again our relationship with our clients. So I would suggest that you always utilize a registered debt collector from that process. But even though the person can't pay, and now that's the next point, you may not withhold reports or treatment even if they can't pay. So that's an interesting ethical dilemma. You're seeing a client that is suicidal, they can't pay, so how do you go about managing that? Interesting. Bartering with clients. Now bartering basically means is you're supplying a person supplies either a good or a service in exchange for your services. That usually happens when a person can't afford to pay for psychological services. So for example, you are writing a psychometric report for a guy's kid, but he can't pay for it, so you say he must work on your car or fix your radiator or whatever the case might be. So it's an exchange for a good and a service for another good or a service. But this may only be done if it's not exploitative. So you can't ask a person to fully service your car, and you know a car service costs, for argument's sake, 4,000 Rand, and you only see the person for an hour, and that's your normal billing is like 700 Rand. So you can't engage, you can't exploit the nature of the relationship because the client can't afford it. And finally, in no circumstance may you withhold emergency services. So if a person is, even if they can't pay, in such a scenario where medical doctors, an interesting one where a person has a heart attack on a plane, you can't withhold the services because he doesn't have the medical aid card or whatever the case might be for the client. He must engage in that service to be able to treat that person. The billing and those type of aspects can be arranged later, but you're not allowed to withhold emergency. Okay, one that's very prominent in my field at least, and in psychometrists, is the utilize of assessment activities. You're only allowed to utilize assessments in professional contexts. You're only allowed to utilize these techniques or these instruments for its appropriate use. So you can't utilize MMPI-2 for selection purposes, as an example. You can, but you need to be able to justify it, obviously. So you must utilize the instruments for the right reasons and not for others. In every scenario, a person must know exactly what they're being assessed for, what their rights and responsibilities are, what the costs are associated with it, and so on and so forth. They need to provide consent and know what, and need to provide written consent of it. When we talk about test development, tests, you must always ensure it's your responsibility to ensure that tests are valid and reliable. Now, something that I've noticed in practice is that some of the practitioners utilize an instrument, and you ask them, well, why are you utilizing this and not something else? And they would say, well, and it's valid and reliable, more valid and reliable. I'm like, okay, how do you know that? No, the book says it. I'm like, okay, what does the book say? No, I don't know, but the company that sold it to me told me it's valid and reliable, and I believe them. Remember again, it's your responsibility. You are responsible for the treatment and the activities in which you engage in, and you need to be able to ensure and be comfortable with the test that you're utilizing and not just taking it at face value. Within our context, cross-cultural assessments are very important because most of the older instruments are not cross-culturally valid, yet they are still being used today in practice. So you must always utilize instruments that are valid for blacks, whites, Indians, for Zulus, Xhosas, Afrikaans people. It's important. Next, you must always communicate the end results. You must always communicate what the results are with your clients. I believe that you do not assess an individual if you do not provide feedback to the client and to the person that you're being assessed. Right? The next part, very similar to the person's right to confidentiality, the management and maintaining of the test data. Who can you release the test data to? Under no circumstances do you release the test data to the raw data to a client or to the individual being assessed. Under no circumstances. You need to manage and maintain that. So you have to keep your assessments for at least 5 years. Thereafter they need to be destroyed. And that's where we talk about maintaining test security, which is the next one. You can't let your Rorschach and your TAT lie on the table for everybody to see, or even test results for that matter. It must always be locked up under lock and key, maintained in a private, confidential, and safe and secure environment. Let's get to therapeutic activities. Similar to everything else we've spoken about, the first thing is the person must give informed consent to therapy. Informed written consent at all times. When we talk about couple, family, and group therapy, you need to be able to show that you are competent in those types of activities. And how do we show competence again? By 1, that you've been academically trained in it. Number 2, that you have been mentored in that process. And number 3, that you're constantly maintaining your skill set in those areas. Next part, try and avoid sexual intimacies with your current clients. You're not allowed to engage in sexual relationships with clients at all, given the nature of the therapeutic relationships. Also, you're not allowed to engage in sexual relationships with friends and families and relatives of the people that you are seeing, because that also impacts on the effectiveness of the therapy, but also on the nature and the dynamics of the relationship with the client. Also, you're not allowed to engage in therapy with former sexual partners. Why? Why do you think? Finally, well, not finally, we spoke about sexual harassment previously, but you're only allowed to engage in sexual relationship with the client 24 months after the therapy has ended. And even then it's a bit sketchy, in my opinion. When we get to the final part and saying that we spoke about informed consent to therapy at the beginning, saying how long you think the therapy will last, what the approach is going to be, and etc. But you also need to prepare your client for when you're going to terminate your services. You need to terminate the services when you believe that the client no longer needs it. You can't just continue for the sake of continuing therapy just because you want to make money. So it's important to know and negotiate and discuss with your client when you feel that he is going to, when you're going to stop therapy. The next one, you should terminate therapy when your personal safety as a psychologist or psychometrist is being put in jeopardy. But this again is a very very grey area, because how do you define if your personal safety and security is at risk? And then how do you ensure that you protect yourself as well as the client and the other people involved? So this is one of the things that I think is very important for us to start to think about. When do you feel uncomfortable in a scenario, as a woman, for example, seeing a client and him making sexual advances, even though you're saying, or starting to indicate where you live, and he saw you there and doing this. So when you start to feel uncomfortable, it's important to put that on the table, but also to know when you feel uncomfortable that you'll be able to manage that appropriately. Finally, before terminating the relationship, it's important to start to prepare your client for the termination of the relationship. In other words, 2 or 3 sessions before the end, you say, listen, I'm thinking we're making great progress. I think we'll only see each other maybe once or twice anymore, and then start to engage in what we call pre-termination counseling. So providing the skills and abilities to end the relationship effectively. Okay, now that we've discussed all the types of ethical problems and ethical guidelines, it's important for us now to differentiate between what's the difference between an ethical problem and an ethical dilemma. Because this you'll get in your exam. You'll get asked, how would you discuss and list all of the ethical problems and discuss the ethical dilemma? And you need to be able to understand what that is to be able to manage that, or to write about it. Okay, so an ethical problem is something that's quite easy. It's something that's black and white, it's something that's quite clear. For example, psychometrists are not allowed to utilize projective techniques. That is indicated word for word in the Health Professions Act. For another example, there are certain things that need to be on your business card or on your marketing material. That's black or white. You're not allowed to engage in sexual relationships with your clients. That's black or white. There's a right or wrong. So that's an ethical problem. If a person just advertises, psychologist, phone this number today, that's unethical because they did not indicate what type of psychologist they are, what services they're rendering, what their qualifications are, and so on and so forth. If a psychometrist utilizes projective techniques, that is unethical because it's a therapeutic intervention technique as well. So, quite straightforward and clear cut. Ethical dilemmas, on the other part, that's where we get to that grey area. There's no clear distinction between what's right or wrong. There's a choice between what is more right or more wrong in a given scenario for you as the individual. So both as outcomes are going to have a negative outcome, but so there's unsatisfactory alternatives, and you need to decide which is going to be the most appropriate one for you. If I can give a practical example, a couple of years ago I saw a clinical psychologist, about 43 years old. She was female. She came to me for personal development and growth. During the sessions it came out that she is homosexual, and there's nothing wrong with that. She then indicated that she would open up social media profiles, act as a man, and start to add her current clients as friends on Facebook, and start to talk to them and so on, to try and solicit nude pictures of the clients and so on and so forth. So in the therapeutic relationships, in the therapy, she would say, you need to, wow, you've met this guy online, his name is Jan, that's great to hear, I think you should engage a bit more with Jan because you need that relationship. So she would support it from a therapeutic perspective, but she would also be the one that's soliciting the nude pictures and so on and so forth from the client. Okay, so now it becomes a bit of a problem. There's not really, it's black and white, it's grey, it's like, am I going to disclose, how am I going to manage the situation, and etc. So that's an ethical dilemma. Am I going to report it to the Health Professions Council and give her for incapacity, or am I not? Do I have a responsibility towards, who do I have a responsibility towards here? Towards her as my client, towards her clients, to the profession, to society, who do I have allegiance for that matter to? And that is an ethical dilemma. How do I manage that? Am I going to disclose the fact that a person is indicating that he's going to go and kill his mother if you feel that his mother is in danger? Will I engage in marriage counseling with, or how do I engage with, how do I manage knowing that an educational psychologist is working within industry and doing selections for students, knowing that they have been formally trained in that? So there are various types of ethical dilemmas. Those are the things that are not black or not white, it's grey, and you need to be able to choose with what option you're going to take. For example, am I going, in that scenario where I spoke about the 43-year-old clinical psychologist, in her scenario, am I going to disclose or am I not going to disclose? If I am going to disclose, I need to make sure that I've got all of the evidence associated with that scenario, and that I can justify the reason why I've taken a specific action. Because both ways, someone's going to get hurt in the process. So I need all of the evidence, I need to be able to argue it effectively from a legislative perspective. So think of yourself as a little bit of a mini psychologist. So in the exam, if you get a question like that, I would say, mention which type, that you know that there are two outcomes. So I would say something like, in this scenario, there are one of two possible approaches. The one is to disclose, the other one is not to disclose. That provides the person marking your script with the indication that you at least know that there's a difference. And then based on your personal inclination, say, because of the contrast between these two aspects, I'm going to disclose because, and then stating the reasons why, obviously supported from a legislative perspective. Okay, so I'm going to provide you with a technique now on how to identify problems or how to manage these ethical dilemmas. This is the approach that I would suggest you utilize when studying or writing for your exam on. The first thing is we need to identify firstly what are the ethical problems in a case study and what are the dilemmas. So we need to differentiate between the two. That's the first thing that we need to do. The second part is we need to consider the context in which this thing is happening. So in other words, something might be wrong in one context but might be right in another. So disclosing information in one context might be right versus something in another might not be. The third step, you need to identify and utilize all of the available resources that you have, both ethical and legal. The next part, consider your beliefs and your values, because that influences the way in which you are going to make the decision and implement the process, and understand how your values and your beliefs influence the decision that you make. Number 5, now you start to develop possible strategies and to address the problem, possible solutions. Once you've come up with a list of solutions, go and look at the potential consequences of each one of these types of solutions, the pros and the cons, basically. Once you've had that and you write number 7 down at any question that the Health Professional Council asks you in your exam, you always go discuss your strategy solutions with a more senior psychologist. After you've discussed it and you've come up with the best possible solution, you're going to choose to implement a specific course of action, and you implement it. Finally, once implemented, you assess the outcome and the possible consequences. Okay, so let me give you some examples of ethical problems. Firstly, should I rent my garden flat out to a current client? A couple to which I'm providing marriage counseling asked me to serve as a mediator in the divorce. Should I? Should I accept a gift from a client? Should I buy a car from a dealership owned by a client? I don't know if a car-speaking work colleague asks me as an English person to see her kids whom I don't know because they're having social problems at school. Should I? Shouldn't I? It's important that we just start to think about, types of ethical problems, type of ethical, issues, so that we can start to differentiate the ethical problems from ethical dilemmas. So, let's talk about the board exam and how it works. Usually it's like a 3-hour type of exam. It involves both theoretical types of questions as well as ethical questions. So there's 2 sections, and for both sections you need to get a minimum of 70, or you need to get an average of 70, but for the ethics section you should get at least 70. Now let's talk a little bit about that. What can you expect from the board exam? So usually what they'll give some theoretical questions. If I can speak from an industrial psychology perspective, they would say, what are the 7 steps to submitting someone for impairment? How would you determine whether or not a test is valid or reliable? What's the difference between an industrial and organizational psychologist and a human resource practitioner? What type of interventions do you get? So there will be some theoretical types of questions alongside the study material that you had to have studied. All right. Then they'll have a section on ethics and ethical problems and dilemmas. So they'll give you a couple of case studies, and they'll say, and I'll upload some of these case studies for you when I do this on YouTube. They'll give you some case studies and say, okay, identify the ethical process or the ethical dilemmas. How will you go about managing it? What's the most appropriate strategy? So they'll ask you those types of questions. In these scenarios, I would suggest that you start off in an ethical dilemma or an ethical case study, read through it and try to identify first what are the ethical dilemmas, what's the main ethical dilemma in the process, and then highlight all of the ethical problems that you experience or that you notice. Based on that, start to write what the problem or what the ethical dilemma is and how it is you're going to go about justifying the reason that you've chosen a specific course of action. So as mentioned previously, if the case study revolves around the ability to disclose or not disclose, always mention that there are two options. I can disclose and I can't disclose. Based on the current scenario, I choose that I will not disclose based on the following. And then you list your reasons, supported by the content of the legislation as well as the different forms of the Health Professions Council, so or the ethical documents that they have. So that's what I will do in those types of scenarios. If you want to go and look at what are the types of questions that you'll get, go to Google Scholar or Google News and put in psychology and limit it to the past year within the South African context and see what are the main issues that have made the newspapers, what are the main challenges. Go to the South African Journal of Industrial Psychology, go to the South African Journal of Psychology, look at the past year, what are the main themes from the articles that have come about. Those will provide you an indication of the types of questions that you'll be getting, the types of case studies that you will be getting exposed to. What else can I say? In the next couple of slides, I will give you some examples of some of the questions that have been asked in the past exam papers. Alright, so here's an example of a case study that was asked a couple of years ago. On the 23rd of December, an 18-year-old woman presented to her family doctor for an initial obstetric examination, accompanied by a 27-year-old boyfriend. Initial case history revealed that the baby was underdeveloped as a result of drug use at the age of 16 weeks. And living in a mobile home with her partner. She was strongly considering giving the baby up for adoption because of financial and other reasons. Her answers to the screening violence history questions by a doctor indicated that she had been beaten by her father from preschool age until the age of 15. Her parents then divorced. Furthermore, she stated that her present partner had slapped her around a bit on several occasions and that once he accidentally dragged her by the car during an argument. He had slammed the driver's door, started the truck and put it into gear, reportedly not without realizing that her dress was caught in the door. On further questioning, the patient stated that she was not happy in the relationship and in fact did not feel safe. However, she stated that she had no place else to go and expressed optimism about the future because her partner had begun to attend church and stated that he wanted to be a good father. As you are the only registered industrial psychologist at the hospital, the woman is referred to you for urgent intervention. So, some of the questions. What are the ethical considerations of this current study? Discuss the ethical dilemma present in the study and how would you go about managing it? Second case study. A personal assistant of a CEO of a large manufacturing company's performance dropped significantly during the past December recess. It became apparent that she had lost a lot of weight and that she always had painkillers on her desk. The CEO, a very compassionate man by nature, kept inquiring what is wrong. However, the PA keep answering nothing, I'm just tired. The CEO sends the PA to you as the industrial psychologist with the instruction that she should tell you what's going on, otherwise she's going to be fired the same day. What are her rights and those of her? Final case study. A recent widow phones you as an industrial psychologist working for an NGO in a frantic state, indicating that she desperately needs to see you. Her husband died as a result of AIDS-related illnesses 14 months ago, and she has been unable to cope with her loss. In an attempt to cope with this loss, she then went online and googled, "I am so sad because my husband died and I can't get over it," and was directed to a website of a New Age church. On the site, she was requested to complete an emotional assessment questionnaire, which is not on the list of classified tests with the HPCSA, which indicated that she had emotional blocks and could be suicidal. The site indicates that she needs urgent attention and urgent help and needs to contact the church immediately. Upon contacting the church, she needs to pay 6,000 Rand for personal feedback on the questionnaire. Arriving at the church, the priest reviewed the results and with utter shock indicated that she is not ready for the feedback as it might be more adverse to her current state than she currently is in. She was instructed to complete 2 more courses relating to unblocking the emotions, which total 22,000 Rand. She tried to claim these costs back from her medical aid, but as a result of the fact that the church or its employees or volunteers weren't registered professionals with the HPCSA or registered with the BHF, the medical aid would not pay for these costs. She approached her medical doctor, who referred her to a good friend of his, a life coach, for counseling. During the first session, the life coach engaged in hypnotherapy. During the session, it became apparent that the widow's manager, with whom she had an affair, Lucky Shimbonga, his wife died of AIDS. it also became apparent that one of Lucky's very close female friends at work, who always works very late with Lucky, has now been promoted to line manager. Discuss the ethical issues emanating from the scenario and advise on how you will address it. These are just some of the types of questions that you will be getting in the examination. It's important, very important, to take your time to write everything down that you can think of when it comes to a specific question. I know 3 hours sounds like a lot. It really isn't. It's important for you to write down everything that you can think of when it comes to these types of questions, because it's kind of like a mind dump. Eventually you'll have to, there's so many things that you can write for so little marks, and you're not sure what you will get marks for. Therefore, it's important to plan your questions appropriately when you get your paper. Read through it once, scan through it. Make sure that you understand the questions. Look at the ones that you think will take you the longest. Plan your answers appropriately. With that said, I'm going to say thank you so much for listening to my video, my presentation, and if you've got any questions, my email is listed at the bottom of the page and will be at the bottom of the video. Good luck with your examination, and I hope you pass. Let me know how it goes.